The winter wind cut through the courtyards of Whitehall Palace, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the faint toll of distant bells. Inside the air was heavy, a suffocating blend of burning incense, candle wax, and something far more sinister, the sweet, cloying stench of rot. In the vast bedchamber, dark velvet drapes swallowed what little daylight filtered through the frost-covered windows. Beneath them, England's most feared monarch lay swollen and motionless, the bulk of his body shifting only with the labor of each breath. The fire roared in the hearth, but the king shivered as if trapped in an endless frost. The courtiers called him the Lion of England. Now, the lion lay dying, but his claws, sharpened over decades of ruthless rule, had not yet dulled. Even in his final weeks, Henry VIII's orders could send a man to the block before sundown. More than once, his attendants had found him with pen in hand, struggling to scrawl shaky signatures on death warrants. Yet this was not always the man England had known. There was a time when Henry's name stirred not fear, but awe. As a young prince, he had been the very picture of Renaissance vigor. Broad-shouldered, golden-haired, his skin bronzed from hunting under the summer sun, he could outjoust the finest knights of France, compose music that charmed the courts of Europe, and debate theology with scholars who whispered that the boy might rival even Erasmus. Foreign ambassadors wrote home with admiration. Here was a king in waiting who combined athletic grace with the education of a humanist. At banquets, he could drain a goblet, laugh with his nobles, then rise before dawn to lead the hunt. His reign, many believed, would be England's golden age. But time is a cruel sculptor. The first cracks appeared as early as his 30s. A misjudged tilt at the joust sent him crashing to the ground, his armored bulk pinning him beneath a horse. He recovered, or so it seemed, but the wound to his leg never truly healed. Over the years it became a permanent ulcer, refusing to close, weeping foul-smelling pus no matter how physicians poulticed it. For a king, obsessed with physical prowess, the injury was more than pain. It was humiliation. Hunting and tournaments grew rarer. The once lean frame thickened. The court whispered, and Henry listened. By his mid-40s, he had begun to swell alarmingly. Physicians spoke in guarded tones of dropsy and surfeit, though the truth, as modern medicine suspects, was a spiral of gout, infection, and the creeping shadow of diabetes. The man who had once been England's most eligible knight was becoming a prisoner in his own body. As the king's waistline expanded, so too did the paranoia in his mind. Court life, already a dangerous game, became a shifting minefield. Friends of yesterday were enemies by dawn. Those who failed to flatter him correctly might find themselves accused of treason by supper, and yet, even as his body betrayed him, Henry's will seemed carved from iron. He had torn England from the Pope's grasp, executed queens and ministers without hesitation, and forced Parliament to bend to his personal vision of the Church. But now, with his third wife, Jane Seymour, dead in childbirth, and their frail son, Edward, his only male heir, the specter of succession loomed over the realm. Two factions circled the dying monarch like vultures. The Catholic conservatives, led by the aging Duke of Norfolk, dreaming of restoring Rome's influence. The Protestant reformists, headed by Edward Seymour, Jane's ambitious brother, determined to cement the break with Rome. Each waited for the moment the king's breath faltered, and each feared the other would seize the boy before the crown cooled. It was in the winter of 1546, that Henry's decline became impossible to hide. His leg ulcers worsened, requiring layers of bandages that had to be changed daily, sometimes hourly, as the wounds seeped through. His face, once the face of England's golden prince, was bloated and sallow, the eyes sunken deep in yellowed flesh. The king now relied on a specially constructed mechanical hoist to lift his massive body from bed to chair, and yet proclamations from the palace insisted Henry was in robust health, preparing for spring festivities. Outside those walls, Londoners sensed the truth. The royal kitchens received fewer orders. The king's musicians were rarely summoned. The palace gates, once flung open to processions and masques, remained guarded and shut. Within the bedchamber, a strange quiet ruled. Servants moved like shadows, speaking in hushed voices, the scrape of a chair leg sounding louder than it should. Physicians stood at the ready, their hands stained with ointments and strange concoctions. Ground pearls, powdered bone, boiled onions, none of which slowed the rot. Henry himself seemed to oscillate between lucidity and fevered delirium. At times he summoned ministers to discuss the defense of Calais or the coinage of the realm. At others he muttered to unseen figures, calling the names of wives long dead, or enemies long executed. One night, a messenger brought him news of a plot uncovered in Norfolk's household. The king's lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. "Even now," he rasped, "they think I am weak." Within hours, an execution warrant was drawn. Norfolk's fate was sealed, or so it seemed. The act sent a chill through the court. The lion's body might be failing, but his teeth were still sharp. Outside, snow began to fall over London, blanketing the city in silence. But inside Whitehall, silence was a mask for something far more dangerous. The slow, inevitable approach of the end, and the deadly scramble for what would come after. The door to Henry VIII's private chamber was a threshold few dared to cross. The moment the oak swung inward, the scent struck like a blow. Sweet, clinging, and unmistakable, the smell of a body turning against itself. Thick tapestries hung over the windows to trap the warmth, but they also trapped the odor, making the air inside thick enough to taste. Perfumed braziers burned day and night, their smoke swirling around the vast canopy bed, draped in black and crimson. Upon it lay the king. His legs, swaddled in linen, were more bandage than flesh. Beneath the wrappings, angry ulcers festered, skin peeling away to reveal glimpses of bone, the wounds oozing a foul mixture of pus and blood. Court physicians rotated in shifts, removing soaked cloths, sprinkling powdered pearls, applying boiled onion poultices, even, in the most desperate hours, placing freshly killed pigeons, split open, against the sores in the belief that life might draw out rot. None of it worked. The pain was constant, a grinding, gnawing agony that clawed at his mind as much as his body. Henry's temper, already infamous, had sharpened into something volcanic. A misbuttoned doublet, a dropped tray, even a servant's visible grimace at the smell could unleash a torrent of curses. Or worse, a sudden command for imprisonment. To dull the suffering, his physicians turned to opium. It softened the edges of the pain but clouded his thoughts. One moment he would debate scripture with Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, probing the fine lines between Catholic ritual and Protestant doctrine. The next, he would whisper to Jane Seymour's long-dead shade, asking if she still loved him. Not everyone was permitted to witness this decline. Access to the king was controlled with fanatical precision. At the center of this circle of silence, stood Cranmer himself, flanked by a handful of trusted attendants, and guarded by men whose loyalty was to the factions now circling the throne. From the Catholic side, the Duke of Norfolk's allies lingered in the corridors, hoping to position themselves for control of young Edward. From the Protestant camp, Edward Seymour and his brother Thomas worked to place their men in the sick room, arguing that they alone could relieve the king's mind. The sick room was no longer merely a place of healing. It was the front line of a war for England's future. Even in his fevered state, Henry sensed it. "They think me gone already," he muttered one night, his voice like dry parchment, his eyes, bloodshot but still fierce, locked on Cranmer. "I will show them who dies when I say so." Days later, a chilling demonstration followed. A sealed letter arrived at Norfolk's residence, a royal command for his arrest on charges of treason. Word spread in hushed tones. The Duke had been brought to the Tower. For a moment it seemed the Protestant faction had won, but outside the sick room, the other side plotted counterstrokes, whispering to foreign ambassadors, offering quiet promises in exchange for future support. The physicians, meanwhile, grew more frantic. They began heating iron plates and pressing them to the king's skin in hopes of drawing infection away from the leg wounds. The chamber filled with the hiss of searing flesh and the muffled gasps of attendants who could not mask their horror. Henry bore it with clenched teeth and closed eyes, a single bead of sweat tracing the deep lines of his face. When the pain finally broke him, his roar shook the room. "Enough! Leave me to my prayers." But his prayers, if they came, were not those of peace. Witnesses reported him thrashing in his sleep, crying out names: More, Cromwell, Anne, as if ghosts gathered in the darkened chamber to judge him. The secrecy surrounding his condition extended beyond the palace walls. In official proclamations, Henry was described as preparing for the spring hunt and consulting with his council on matters of the realm. The lie was necessary. England's enemies, France, Scotland, and the Holy Roman Empire, needed to believe the king still ruled with a steady hand. Within London, however, the rumors swelled. Tradesmen who had supplied the palace noted the drop in orders. Messengers were seen riding at night, cloaks pulled tight against the cold. At the river, boatmen whispered that the king was already half gone. One icy morning in the early January, the king's condition worsened. A sudden seizure shook his massive frame, his right arm jerking violently before falling limp at his side. Physicians crowded the bed, forcing bitter draughts between his lips, fanning his face, speaking to him as if words alone could anchor him to life. When the fit passed, he lay panting, his mouth twisted, one eye drooping. "Do not let them," he began. Then the words dissolved into a rasp. Cranmer leaned close, trying to catch the rest, but the king's gaze had drifted to some point far beyond the chamber walls. Outside, in a smaller room lit by a single candle, Edward Seymour met with his brother in whispers. They spoke of troop movements, of securing the Tower, of placing loyal men in key fortresses. Every heartbeat brought them closer to the moment the crown would pass, and they intended to be ready when it did. But they were not alone in their plotting. In another corner of the palace, Norfolk's allies huddled over their own plans, praying for one more chance to sway the king's will before the end. In the bedchamber, Henry's breathing slowed, each inhale a labored act of will. The lion was weakening, but the jungle around him was only growing louder. In the echoing corridors of Whitehall Palace, Silence became a weapon. Orders were whispered, not spoken. Servants carried trays with the careful precision of thieves, every footstep measured to avoid. The groan of ancient floorboards. The command had come directly from the Archbishop of Canterbury. No word leaves these walls. The king's condition was now the most dangerous secret in England. If foreign courts learned Henry was near death, the Channel could swarm with enemy sails before the new king's coronation. Access to the royal bedchamber narrowed to a handful of figures. Each was bound by oath, each aware that a loose tongue could mean the block. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving wife, was kept at a distance for long stretches, permitted only brief audiences when the king was strong enough to recognize her. Inside, the sick room had taken on the quality of a shrine and a prison. The black velvet hangings drank the candlelight, turning the vast chamber into a cavern of shadows. The air smelled of incense and roses, but beneath it lurked the unmistakable tang of decay, a scent that clung to clothing and hair long after one left the room. Henry drifted in and out of lucidity. Some days he would summon ministers to discuss fortifications or the defense of Boulogne, his voice steady, his commands precise. The next he would demand the return of Catholic Mass in his private chapel, only to order Protestant prayers before nightfall. Those closest to him whispered of visions that haunted his sleep. Anne Boleyn at the foot of his bed, her dark eyes unblinking. Thomas More, silent and stern. Cromwell, standing with hands clasped, waiting. Once, in the middle of a winter storm, he called for Jane Seymour by name, reaching into the darkness as if her hand might still find his. The court scribes noted the change. The king's handwriting, once bold and sweeping, had shrunk into cramped, trembling lines. His signature, the very stamp of royal authority, now wandered unevenly across the page. More than one counselor murmured that the realm was already being governed in his name, not by his will. Yet even in weakness, Henry could still lash out. When a courtier hesitated to deliver a message for fear of disturbing the king's rest, Henry erupted, his voice cutting through the chamber. "Disturb me. I am England. If England rests, it dies." By the final days of January 1547, the mask could no longer hold. Those who saw him understood. The lion's roar had faded to a rasp. His breath rattled in his chest, his massive frame sunken beneath the bedclothes. The seizures came more frequently now, leaving his right side heavy and unresponsive. On the 27th, Cranmer was summoned urgently. The king's eyes were half-lighted, his lips pale, the words struggling to form. The archbishop leaned close, his voice low. "Your Majesty, if you place your faith in Christ, give me some token." The moment stretched. Somewhere outside, the wind shook the shutters. Then slowly, heavily, Henry's left hand rose. His fingers closed around Cranmer's. The grip was weak, but it was there. One final act of will. Cranmer would later swear to it. The king had given his last confession, not in words, but in that single squeeze. Historians have argued over it ever since. Protestants hailed it as proof of a deathbed conversion, a final renunciation of papal ceremony. Catholics dismissed it as the reflex of a dying man, stripped of all theological meaning. But in the sick room there was no debate, only the knowledge that the king's time was measured in hours. Outside the chamber, the factions tightened their plans. Edward Seymour prepared his move, ensuring the guard captains were loyal securing keys to the Tower and the Treasury. Norfolk's remaining allies scrambled for leverage, sending secret notes to Spain and Rome. In the kitchens, the fires burned low. No banquets would be served tonight. The palace seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a sound that would signal both an ending and a beginning, the silence after a final breath. Shortly after midnight, the king's eyes fluttered open one last time. He looked toward the heavy curtains, as if seeing something beyond them. A single word escaped his lips, so softly that even the nearest attendant could not be sure what it was. Then the lids closed. The room stilled. The lion was not yet gone, but his shadow had already fallen over the realm. The end came before dawn on January 28th, 1547. The chamber was dim. The candles burned low, their wax pooling in quiet rivulets. Outside, frost gripped the palace roofs. The Thames lay under a skin of ice. Inside, the king's breathing, harsh, irregular for days, grew shallow. Each gasp rattled like a chain dragged over stone. Then it stopped. The attendants froze, watching for the rise of his chest. None came. Archbishop Cranmer, already at the bedside, closed the king's eyes and bowed his head. No prayers rang out. No trumpets announced the moment. For all his life's thunder, Henry VIII left the world in a silence so complete it seemed unnatural. The reaction was not grief, not yet. It was discipline. By long-established order, the death of the monarch was not to be spoken beyond those present until the Privy Council convened. Servants were sworn again to secrecy. The doors to the king's apartments were barred from the inside. Guards stood in double ranks at the outer gates. Those who had been in the room slipped out one by one, carrying no more than their own breath as witness. The reason for this silence was simple. Power unguarded invites predators. A dead king left a dangerous vacuum, and Henry's heir, Edward, was only 9 years old. For 3 days, the realm was told nothing. In official proclamations, the king was said to be in council or in repose. Only a tight knot of counselors knew the truth, and they used those hours to reshape England's future. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and uncle to the boy king, moved first. Before the sun had fully risen on the day of Henry's death, Seymour summoned the captains of the guard to his chambers, swearing them to his personal service. Keys to the Tower of London changed hands before most in the palace had finished their morning bread. From there, the moves came quickly. Letters to loyal garrisons ordering readiness. Summons to reformist allies to attend council without delay. Quiet promises to powerful nobles of lands and titles in exchange for their votes. By the second night, Seymour's grip was tightening like a vice. In the city below, the air was restless. Messengers on fast horses were seen leaving Whitehall under cover of darkness. Barges crossed the frozen Thames with cloaked figures aboard. The markets hummed with speculation. Illness, they said, or another plot uncovered. None dared speak the word death. Only the foreign ambassadors suspected, noting the unusual absence of the king's signature from the day's proclamations. They sent coded dispatches to Paris, Brussels, and Rome, each betting on who might hold the reins in London before the week was out. On the morning of January 31st, the game ended. The bells of London began to toll. Slow, deliberate, unending. The announcement rolled through the city. Henry, by the grace of God, King of England, France, and Lord of Ireland, is dead. But the words that followed mattered even more. Long live King Edward VI. By the time the news reached the people, the real power was already in Seymour's hands. That very day, he was proclaimed Lord Protector of the realm and Duke of Somerset, ruling England in his nephew's name. The Duke of Norfolk's supporters found themselves locked out of the council chamber, their petitions ignored, their influence already stripped. In Whitehall, the king's body lay cold in its bed, the chamber still heavy with the smell of sickness and the faint, metallic tang of death. Embalmers were summoned under strict order to preserve the remains. Though the work would prove far more difficult than they expected, the corpse had begun to decompose with alarming speed, a consequence of the infections that had ravaged him in life. The embalmers removed the organs, filling the cavities with aromatic herbs, resin, and powdered spices. Even so, the odor lingered. Special carpenters were called to construct a coffin wide enough to contain his massive frame. It would be lead-lined, both to preserve the remains and to guard against any foul seepage during the long journey to Windsor. That evening, Seymour stood in the council chamber, the only man at the table whose position was secure. He did not smile. He did not speak of triumph. He spoke instead of continuity and the will of His Majesty. But those who had been there knew the truth. Henry's will had already been bent to fit the designs of the living. London streets filled with the sound of mourning. Black banners unfurled, shops closed their shutters, church bells swung in heavy arcs. But among the crowds, mourning was mingled with unease. Henry VIII had ruled for nearly 4 decades. For many, he was the only monarch they had ever known. His sudden absence was like the sun vanishing from the sky. Above it all, the palace stood dark against the winter sky, holding the body of a man whose shadow would stretch over England long after the flesh beneath the velvet had turned to dust. The embalmers arrived at Whitehall under cover of night. Their carts bore chests of resin, powdered herbs, beeswax, and fine linens, all the tools of a trade that was part medicine, part theater. But even seasoned hands paused at the sight before them. The body on the bed was immense, the swollen limbs straining the seams of the shroud. His face had lost the last traces of life's color, the flesh now tinged with a sickly gray yellow. Beneath the wrappings on his legs, the ulcers had opened further in death, the surrounding tissue softening, the odor thick and clinging. The work began at once. According to Tudor custom, the body of a king was to be preserved for a lying in state that might last days or even weeks. But the infections that had plagued Henry in life had already set decay in motion. The embalmers cut carefully, removing the internal organs and placing them in sealed containers. The cavities were filled with a pungent blend of myrrh, rosemary, and powdered orris root. Sheets soaked in aromatic oils were layered over the corpse, followed by fresh linen wrappings. Even so, the heat of the chamber and the sheer mass of the king's body made the work a race against time. The smell persisted, stubborn against every measure. Carpenters were summoned to the palace to solve a problem no Tudor craftsman had faced before. The coffin of England's king would not fit the standard royal bier. The new design was unprecedented, nearly twice the width of a nobleman's casket, lined with lead to contain both the weight and any further leakage. It required additional bearers, strong men drawn from the yeomen of the guard, to lift it from the bedchamber. As the lid was lowered and the final nails struck, the room seemed to exhale. The embalmers withdrew in silence, their work done, their faces pale. The lying in state began in the great hall of Whitehall Palace. Draped in black and gold, the coffin rested on a raised platform surrounded by flickering candles. A wax effigy of the king, dressed in robes of state and clutching the scepter, stood above it. For even in death, Henry was to be seen as he was in life. Broad-shouldered, proud, unbroken, courtiers and foreign envoys passed before the bier, bowing deeply. Some wept. Others, more political than sentimental, studied the wax face and wondered how much of its power would pass to the boy who now wore the crown. On the second night, a mishap whispered about for years occurred. The lead lining of the coffin, strained by the gases building within, split at one seam. A dark fluid seeped onto the chapel floor. Servants rushed to clean it, scattering rushes and herbs to mask the smell. Later, a story spread, whether truth or cruel invention, that dogs in the chapel licked at the seepage before they could be driven off. In the whispered version of the tale, preachers drew the image into a moral lesson, the mighty brought low, the flesh of kings no more sacred than that of the poorest beggar. Preparations for the funeral were carried out with both haste and precision. Seymour understood that the procession would be England's first public glimpse of the new order. Everything, from the number of horses draped in black velvet to the herald's armor, was chosen to signal continuity and strength. Artisans crafted banners bearing the Tudor rose, the arms of England, and the personal device of the late king. The wax effigy was secured atop the coffin, a silent rider for the last journey. Outside the palace gates, London awaited. The cold bit through wool and fur, but still they gathered, apprentices and merchants, widows and children, all straining for a glimpse. For many, this would be the only king they would ever see buried. Inside, the body of Henry VIII lay still beneath layers of lead, linen, and royal pageantry. In life, he had been larger than any man at court. In death, he was heavier still, a weight carried not only by the pallbearers, but by a nation poised between the old lion's reign and the uncertain rule of a child. Dawn broke gray and bitter over London on February 16th, 1547. Frost clung to the cobblestones, the air so cold it seemed to bite the lungs. Outside the gates of Whitehall, a crowd had already gathered. Merchants in wool cloaks, apprentices huddled for warmth, beggars pressing forward to catch a glimpse of history. The palace gates swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. First came the heralds, their black-plumed helmets catching the weak light. Then the banners, the Tudor rose, the arms of England quartered with France, the personal device of Henry VIII, a golden portcullis, each one heavy with meaning, each a reminder of the monarch whose reign had touched every corner of the realm. The coffin emerged next, borne on a massive draped chariot drawn by 8 black horses. Above it sat the wax effigy. Henry in his prime, broad-chested and defiant, clad in scarlet and ermine, the scepter in one hand, the orb in the other. It was a vision designed to erase the memory of the bloated, ulcer-ridden man who had died in Whitehall. Behind the chariot marched the yeomen of the guard, halberds gleaming, their boots striking the stones in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Every step was measured, every pause deliberate. This was not merely a funeral. It was a display of Tudor power, choreographed for the eyes of a kingdom and the watchful gaze of foreign ambassadors. The route wound from Whitehall through the heart of London. Windows overflowed with onlookers, the silence broken only by the creak of leather harnesses, the snort of horses, and the tolling of church bells. In Cheapside, a group of women dropped to their knees as the coffin passed, murmuring prayers. At St. Paul's, the clergy stood in solemn ranks, incense rising in a twisting column above the street. But beneath the public mourning, the procession carried unspoken messages. The presence of so many Protestant lords at the head of the cortege signaled that Edward Seymour's faction now held the reins. Catholic nobles were present, but positioned further back, a calculated choice. The imagery of the banners and the placement of the councillors spoke as clearly as any proclamation. The Reformation would continue. The cold was merciless. Breath fogged in the air, and the mourners lining the route stamped their feet for warmth. Yet no one left. For nearly 4 decades, Henry VIII had been England's embodiment of monarchy. His appetites, his triumphs, his brutality inseparable from the crown itself. Whatever one thought of him, his passing was the end of an age. By nightfall, the procession had reached the outskirts of the city. The coffin and its escort continued along the frozen road toward Windsor, the banners snapping in the wind. In the flickering torchlight, the wax effigy seemed almost alive, the painted eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. 2 days later, they entered the grounds of Windsor Castle. St. George's Chapel awaited, the resting place of kings, its stone walls echoing with centuries of royal ritual. Here, beneath the vaulted ceiling, the coffin was lowered to lie beside Jane Seymour, the queen who had given Henry his long-desired son. It was a choice, heavy with symbolism. Of 6 wives, only Jane had died in the king's favor. By placing her at his side, the Tudor court reinforced the image of Henry as a husband fulfilled, a king whose dynasty would endure through their child. The final rites were read. Candles guttered in the draught from the open doors. Outside, the winter wind carried the sound of bells tolling one last time. When the stone was set in place above the grave, it was simple, almost stark. The grand monument Henry had planned for himself, a towering structure with bronze statues and an equestrian figure, would never be built. Financial strains and political shifts would leave his tomb plain, a contrast to the elaborate pageantry that had carried him there. In the stillness of St. George's Chapel, the court dispersed, each to their own future. For some, the king's death marked the beginning of power. For others, the first step toward exile or the block. Outside, the wind swept across the castle grounds, erasing the tracks of the procession. The man who had ruled England with an iron will, who had reshaped its faith and spilled the blood of queens, now lay beneath cold stone, his kingdom in the hands of a boy, and the men already fighting to rule through him. In the days following Henry VIII's burial, the court wasted no time in recasting his memory. The man himself was gone. The myth was under construction. Painters received commissions to reproduce Hans Holbein's iconic image. Henry at his most formidable, legs braced, hands on hips, gaze fixed forward with an unshakable will. No sign of the ulcers, no hint of the bloated figure hidden beneath his late-life robes. This was the king England would remember, because it was the king the new regime needed them to remember. In audience halls and chapels, the effigy used in the funeral procession was set on display, still clad in scarlet and ermine. It became a silent symbol of continuity, the unbroken chain from Henry to his 9-year-old son. The ceremonies for young Edward VI were calculated to echo his father's authority. When the boy entered the council chamber, courtiers were ordered to bow deeply, as they had to Henry. The throne, when vacant, was treated with the same reverence as if the old king still sat upon it. Even Edward's portraits were modeled after Holbein's Henry, the same broad stance, the same steady gaze, though in the boy's frame it looked more like a costume borrowed from a giant. The message was clear. Henry VIII still ruled through his son. But behind this carefully curated image, the council that Henry had intended to govern collectively began to fracture. His will had named 16 men to act as a regency, balancing one another's power. In reality, Edward Seymour had already outmaneuvered the rest, securing the title of Lord Protector and ruling in the boy's name. The Catholics who had held influence in Henry's later years now found themselves marginalized. The Protestant faction moved swiftly, pushing reforms that the late king had approached with caution. Within months, England's religious direction tilted further toward Protestantism than Henry himself had ever sanctioned. Henry's religious legacy became a prize for both sides. Protestant preachers filled pulpits with tales of the king's final hand squeeze to Cranmer, portraying it as proof of an evangelical deathbed conversion. They spoke of Henry as a monarch who had thrown off the tyranny of Rome and set England on the path to scriptural truth. Catholic voices, more cautious but no less determined, insisted the king had never truly abandoned the old faith. They pointed to his defense of the Mass, his belief in transubstantiation, and his persecution of radical reformers. Their telling, Henry's break with the Pope, was political, not spiritual, an act of sovereignty, not heresy. In truth, Henry's position had always been uniquely his own, Catholic in ritual, Protestant in governance, and entirely personal in authority. But truth mattered less now than narrative. Whoever claimed Henry's legacy could claim the right to shape England's future. The propaganda reached beyond politics and religion. In taverns and marketplaces, ballads began to circulate, some mourning the king's passing, others mocking his appetites and his temper. The most daring singers told stories of the corpse king whose coffin had burst, of dogs licking royal blood from the chapel floor. These tales spread quickly, feeding a more irreverent public memory alongside the official image. Foreign courts joined the game. In France, Henry was eulogized as both a worthy foe and a dangerous neighbor. In Rome, Pope Paul III allowed a mass for the king's soul, a diplomatic gesture that implied forgiveness without conceding legitimacy. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, calculated how a boy on the English throne might tilt the balance of European alliances. Inside England, the shift in power was unmistakable. Seymour used Henry's image as a shield while advancing his own agenda. Coins bearing the late king's face continued to circulate, their presence a reminder that the authority of the crown, and of the man who now wielded it, was unbroken. But in private, even Seymour's allies acknowledged the danger of leaning too heavily on the dead king's shadow. The more they invoked Henry, the more the people might begin to compare the boy's regency to the old lion's rule, and the comparison would not favor the present. By summer, England stood at a crossroads. The old king's ghost haunted both court and country, in portraits, in sermons, in the whispered fears of those who had served him. Henry VIII had been many things: tyrant and patron, reformer and persecutor, lion and butcher. Now in death, he was something else entirely, a weapon wielded by the living in a battle he could no longer control, and in that weapon lay both the strength and the fragility of the new order. For just as Henry had ruled through force of will, so too could his memory turn against those who failed to live up to it. When the Privy Council finally opened the royal ledgers after Henry's death, the truth hit like a hammer. England was broke. The pageantry of the funeral, the black-draped horses, the banners, the endless candles, all of it had been paid for with borrowed coin. The wars in France and Scotland, the lavish banquets, the endless construction of palaces. Whitehall, Hampton Court, none such, had drained the treasury dry. Worse still, the silver coinage in circulation was barely silver at all. In his final years, Henry had resorted to a desperate measure, debasing the currency. Coins that once held fine silver were now heavily alloyed with base metals. The result was a flood of money worth far less than its face, and the creeping specter of inflation was already stalking the realm. The Regency Council, with Edward Seymour at its head, faced an ugly choice: raise taxes, which would enrage the commons, or sell more crown lands, which would permanently weaken the monarchy's wealth. Seymour chose the latter. Monastic lands, seized during Henry's dissolution of the monasteries, were still being parceled out. These sales enriched a new class of gentry and secured Seymour temporary loyalty from powerful buyers. But they also stripped the crown of its most profitable estates. In taverns, old men shook their heads. "The lion's gold is gone," they muttered, "and now they sell the very bones of the realm." The economic pain began to bite hardest in the countryside. Grain prices rose as currency values slid. Small farmers who had once depended on monastic charity for food and seed found themselves adrift. The great abbeys that had offered alms were gone, their lands in the hands of landlords with little interest in charity. In Norfolk, rumors of unrest reached the council's ears. In the West Country, petitions arrived in London, complaining of unlawful enclosures, common lands fenced off by the new owners, leaving villagers without pasture. The seeds of rebellion were being sown in the same soil Henry had claimed for the crown. Seymour's ministers tried to steady the ship. They ordered stricter oversight of coin production, but the damage to trust was already done. Merchants began demanding payment in gold or foreign currency. In London's markets, sellers simply raised prices to match the coin's lost value. The irony was bitter. Henry VIII, who had ruled like a medieval warlord, had also left behind the framework of a more modern bureaucratic state. But that state's survival now depended on money it did not have. At court, whispers began to swirl. Not about the boy king, but about his protector. Seymour was accused of squandering the realm's inheritance to cement his own power. His lavish gifts to allies, the expensive tournaments held in Edward's honor, the grand refurbishments of his own estates, all were paid for in the shadow of the crown's debt. The contrast with Henry's final years was sharp. The old king had been a tyrant, yes, but his sheer force of will had made his extravagance seem like the natural right of a monarch. Seymour, lacking that authority, could not spend without inviting suspicion. By spring, the council was already at odds. Some urged cutting expenditures and halting further land sales. Others, desperate for ready coin, pushed to liquidate whatever remained. The boy on the throne, bright-eyed and studious, was shielded from these arguments, but he could not be shielded from their consequences. In the countryside, the resentment began to take a sharper edge. Ballads once sung about the merry young king shifted in tone. speaking now of hunger, of empty churches, of fields locked behind fences. In the alehouses, men began to speak not just of the king's death, but of whether England had been better off under his heavy hand than under the soft one of a child. The lion's body was buried at Windsor, but his debts walked abroad in the land, gnawing at the bones of his kingdom. They would not be paid in gold alone. They would be paid in unrest, in rebellion, in the slow erosion of the Tudor grip on the realm. In the months after Henry VIII was lowered into the stone floor at Windsor, another kind of dissection began, not of his body, but of the meticulous records kept by his physicians. These were no ordinary notes. Tudor law required the king's doctors to document every treatment, every change in condition, as proof that nothing was left undone. The men who had attended him in those final months knew their reputations, even their lives, might depend on showing they had exhausted every remedy known to medicine. The ledgers were bound in leather, the pages crowded with cramped Latin and English, detailing everything from the swelling of his legs to the exact mixtures applied to his ulcers. They read like a battlefield diary, day after day of assaults on a stubborn, unyielding enemy, his own body. In the final winter alone, the treatments had included onion poultices wrapped in linen to draw forth corruption from the leg wounds, powdered pearls and precious stones mixed into tonics, believed to fortify the heart, live pigeons split in half, their warm flesh pressed to the ulcers to absorb putrefaction, hot cupping along the spine to balance the humors, opium syrup administered in increasing doses to dull the constant pain, boiled herbs in wine used to bathe the legs in the hope of restoring circulation. None of it slowed the rot. As the pages turned, it became clear to those reviewing the records that the king's decline had not been a sudden fall, but a long siege. The leg injury from his jousting accident decades earlier had never truly healed, festering beneath layers of royal silk until it crippled him, combined with swelling in the feet and abdomen, failing eyesight, and sudden rages. It painted a grim picture. Almost immediately, the court physicians began offering retrospective diagnoses. Some insisted the king had suffered from gout, worsened by a lifetime of rich meat and wine. Others blamed the great pox, syphilis, though no firm evidence supported it. A few whispered about melancholia and disordered humors clouding his mind in his final years, a convenient explanation for his bursts of paranoia and cruelty. But these were not purely medical debates. Each diagnosis carried political weight. For the Protestant faction, portraying Henry as a man who had suffered nobly, enduring pain without losing his devotion to the Reformation, bolstered their claim to continue his policies. For Catholic sympathizers, suggesting that his illness was divine punishment for breaking with Rome, reinforced their own narrative, that the king's final years had been haunted by spiritual torment. The people, too, took the king's illness into their own metaphors. Preachers in market towns compared Henry's infected legs to the festering sins of the realm, warning that England's moral decay would require as much cleansing as the king's wounds. In these sermons, the state itself became a body, and the regency its physician, charged with curing a sickness that threatened the whole. In more irreverent circles, the king's obesity and ulcers became the stuff of satire. Ballads mocked the corpse that ruled in velvet, while others sang of how the mighty had been laid low by what common men called the bad leg. Yet for all the ridicule and politicizing, there was also a strange fascination. Physicians across Europe requested copies of the ledgers, eager to study one of the best documented royal deaths of the age. The mixture of medieval remedies and early Renaissance medical thinking, a blend of superstition, humoral theory, and tentative experimentation, became a case study in the limits of even the most privileged care. In the end, the physician's ledgers told two stories. One was of a man besieged by disease, whose power could command every cure, but whose body obeyed none. The other was of a kingdom watching its ruler decay, the smell of his sickness seeping out from the palace walls into the very language of politics and faith. Henry VIII's body had been buried, but his illness, and the meanings drawn from it, would linger far longer, feeding the legends, the propaganda, and the warnings that shaped England's understanding of both kingship and mortality. For 6 months before Henry's death, Catherine Parr had lived in a shadowed uncertainty, the 6th wife of a man who had executed 2 of her predecessors and discarded 2 more. Now the shadow was gone, replaced by the cold clarity of widowhood. In public, she played the grieving queen to perfection, draped in black, speaking in hushed tones, attending memorial services with downcast eyes. But behind closed doors, Catherine moved quickly. Before the summer was out, she had married Thomas Seymour, brother of the Lord Protector and uncle to the new king, a man she had loved before Henry claimed her. The union was risky. For all its romance, it entangled her in the fierce rivalry between Thomas and his elder brother Edward Seymour, and it placed her once again in the volatile game of royal politics. Meanwhile, Edward VI, 9 years old, pale and serious beyond his years, began his reign in name only. The Regency Council met daily, but Edward Seymour ruled in his nephew's stead. The boy sat in on some sessions, listening intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sharp, precocious mind. But the lessons were curated. Seymour's men ensured Edward's tutors leaned heavily into Protestant doctrine, shaping him into the figurehead for the religious reforms they planned to accelerate. In portraits painted during those early months, Edward stands in robes almost too large for him, holding the orb and scepter as if they were toys. The expression in his eyes is calm, but behind that calm lay the awareness, perhaps dim at first, but growing, that he was surrounded by men who saw him less as a boy than as a crown. Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, faced a colder reality. At 31, she was the most prominent Catholic in a court, now dominated by Protestants. Her legitimacy, restored by Henry's will, meant she was next in line if Edward died without heirs, a fact that made her both valuable and dangerous. The Regency limited her movements, stationing watchful attendants in her household. Mass was discouraged. Protestant services were pressed upon her. Mary resisted quietly, maintaining her faith in private chapels, but she understood the cost of defiance. She had lived through her mother's downfall and her own disinheritance. She knew how quickly favor could turn to imprisonment. Elizabeth, just 13, played a more subtle game. She had inherited her mother Anne Boleyn's intelligence and her father's knack for survival. Though Protestant by upbringing, she kept her opinions guarded, speaking with equal courtesy to both factions. Her position was uniquely precarious, declared illegitimate after her mother's execution, restored to the succession by Henry, but still shadowed by the scandal of her birth. Every smile, every gesture was weighed. She could not afford a single misstep. In the months after Henry's death, Elizabeth resided at court under careful watch, her education continuing under humanist tutors. She cultivated an image of the dutiful princess, fluent in languages, skilled with the lute, respectful to her guardians. But beneath the decorum, she was learning to read the currents of power as keenly as she read her Latin texts. The relationships among Catherine, Mary, and Elizabeth shifted constantly. Catherine extended invitations to the princesses, partly from genuine affection, partly to bolster her own position. Mary declined more often than not, wary of the Protestant influence in Catherine's household. Elizabeth accepted, perhaps sensing that proximity to Catherine's new marriage could bring opportunities, or at the very least, valuable information. At court, the rivalries sharpened. Thomas Seymour, restless in his new role as the Queen Dowager's husband, began to chafe under his brother's dominance. He sought favor with the young king, slipping him gifts and speaking to him privately, acts that skirted dangerously close to treason in the eyes of Edward Seymour. Rumors also began to swirl around Thomas's attentions to Elizabeth, then still living under Catherine's care. The whispers hinted at impropriety, though whether they were born of truth or political malice remains debated. What is certain is that these rumors would later resurface, shaping Elizabeth's caution toward both marriage and trust. By the end of that first year without Henry, the women and children he left behind had each carved their own survival strategy. Catherine remarried to secure her heart and her position, but stepping into a rivalry that could consume her. Edward, learning the art of kingship under a protector whose power overshadowed his own. Mary, maintaining her faith in defiance of quiet pressure, holding her claim in reserve. Elizabeth, observing, learning, and adapting, her future unwritten, but her instincts already sharp. The lion was gone, but his pride, scattered, cautious, and surrounded by hunters, remained in the game, and in their lives, as in the realm itself, Henry's shadow still loomed, shaping every choice and every danger that lay ahead. For 37 years, Henry VIII had ruled not merely as England's king, but as its engine. Every policy, every alliance, every execution bore the imprint of his will. Ministers could advise, Parliament could petition, but in the end, England's course was set by one man's word. Now that word was gone. In the council chambers of Edward VI's reign, decisions no longer arrived as thunderclaps from the king's lips. Instead, they were debated, amended, and voted on by men whose authority was borrowed from a child too young to wield it. Edward Seymour sat at the head of the table, the title of Lord Protector before him, but even he felt the limits of his power. Henry had ruled through a potent blend of reward and terror. Seymour had only persuasion and negotiation. Where Henry's glare could silence dissent, Seymour had to bargain for loyalty, trading lands, titles, and favors to keep his council in line. The difference was felt beyond the palace walls. Under Henry, local officials deferred everything to the crown, knowing that royal displeasure could mean ruin. Without his looming presence, governance began to spread outwards. Sheriffs, justices, and regional councils took more initiative, sometimes bending policy to suit local needs before London's orders arrived. What began as necessity started to look like precedent. England was, in small ways, learning to govern itself without the constant hand of the king. The absence of fear altered court life as well. Under Henry, every conversation in the corridors had carried the weight of potential danger. Even the highest nobles could fall overnight. In the first months of Edward's reign, the atmosphere lightened. Courtiers laughed more openly, spoke more freely, and, to the dismay of Seymour, began plotting with less restraint. Intrigue did not vanish. It simply multiplied, no longer held in check by the knowledge that the king's personal wrath could strike at any moment. Without the lion to guard the throne, the jackals grew bolder. Religious policy accelerated in ways Henry had never allowed. The first Book of Common Prayer was prepared within 2 years of his death, replacing Latin Mass with English services. Altars were stripped, images removed, and the old rituals dismantled with a speed that shocked even some reformers. To Seymour and his allies, these were victories. To many of Henry's former supporters, and to the common folk who had clung to familiar rights, they were proof that the boy king's realm was not the same England the old king had left behind. The Treasury's weakness forced more structural changes. Royal finances were increasingly handled by committees, their ledgers scrutinized not just by the Crown's agents, but by powerful landowners whose support was essential to keep the government afloat. This shared oversight, born of fiscal crisis, slowly began to chip away at the idea that the monarch's purse was his alone to command. Even in the army and navy, once the personal pride of Henry, authority began to spread among trusted captains and admirals rather than remaining concentrated in the monarch's direct control. By the time Edward VI reached adolescence, the machinery of government had shifted in ways that could not easily be reversed. When he began to take a more active role, he found himself operating within a framework of councils and shared authority. A framework his father would have smashed apart without hesitation. The paradox was clear. Henry VIII's reign had been the last great expression of medieval-style absolutism in England. His death, by removing the one man who could make such power work, had pushed the realm further toward a more balanced and more bureaucratic system. Yet for all these changes, Henry's shadow lingered. His image still stared down from the walls of council chambers. His statutes remained in force, and his decisions, from the break with Rome to the line of succession, continued to shape every choice made in his absence. In taverns, old men still began their arguments with, "In the king's day." Some remembered him as a tyrant, others as a strong ruler who had kept England's enemies at bay. All agreed that the court would never see another quite like him. The end. Henry VIII left behind a kingdom both strengthened and weakened by his hand. He had secured the Tudor dynasty, but at the cost of sowing divisions that would outlast his children. He had built a navy that would one day dominate the seas, but had drained the treasury to do it. He had claimed to be both Catholic and Protestant, leaving a faith divided and a people uncertain which future they should pray for. Above all, he had shown that the body of a king, for all its crowns and silks, was as mortal as any other. His ulcers, his strokes, his final breath in a darkened chamber were proof that power could not conquer the limits of flesh. As the years passed, England moved on. Edward would reign briefly, Mary would burn for her faith, and Elizabeth would preside over a golden age. But in each of them, some trace of Henry's will, his temper, his contradictions could be found. Echoes of the lion who had once roared loud enough to shake all Europe. And perhaps that was the truest legacy he left. A reminder that kingship is never just the crown, but the man who wears it. And that both, in time, must fall.